It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Ilan Fogel. We're here in Jerusalem. And Ilan, you are passionate about the Shoah, and it would be wonderful to hear about your family roots.
Sure, thanks, Les. So, as you know, I was born and grew up in South Africa. I was born to wonderful parents, but who were both from Czechoslovakia, both Shoah survivors. I was the youngest of three kids by a long shot, and I was also really the only person that I knew amongst my contemporaries who was a child of survivors. It was always fascinating for me. I mean, it was really only once I was a teenager and I traveled abroad and I met kids my age who went to Jewish day schools, let's say in Toronto, in New York, who were in classes with lots of kids who were children of survivors. For me, as a South African, as I said, I didn't know anybody. And the strangest thing that I cannot explain to you until today is that, you know, my parents, there was none of the negativity. It was never like, you know, finish your food because we didn't have food for 3 years, or how can you be so ungrateful for what you have. It was just, they were very positive, forward-looking people, taught us a lot about tolerance and all the rest. But what I know is already from about the age of 5, without having heard one word from them or from my siblings about the Shoah, intuitively I knew that something very, very traumatic had happened to them, and that I needed to ensure that I caused them no agmat nefesh. I can't tell you why, but I knew it, and I really was, and this is not self-congratulatory because I would not encourage this. I was the perfect child. I never answered back. I never stepped out of line. I was never asked, did I do my homework? Because I did it. I never shared any of my worries or concerns with them because I didn't want them to have any worries or concerns. And, you know, it's only when I was about, I guess 10 or 11 that I kind of learned a little bit about their background. And my mom did not speak much, my dad did. My dad actually wrote a memoir about his life. My mom ultimately, and then we can go back a little bit, but ultimately a friend of my sister's in the United States was doing Holocaust survivor testimonies. This is pre-Spielberg. And my mother agreed to talk to her, which we were all very surprised at. And she was not a good interviewer. So we have two stories from my mom because she didn't speak. One was done by my sister's friend who really didn't know how to run an interview. And the second one was done by a woman from Yad Vashem who just did a wonderful, wonderful interview. But I do remember in the first one, my mom sort of at the end of speaking kind of said, wow, like, I thought we were going to talk for 5 or 10 minutes and, you know, whatever, an hour and a half has gone by. Sadly, in a way, I don't have any recordings of my mom's voice. She died very tragically right before I got married, and the only recording I have is this Holocaust testimony. So if I've ever wanted to hear her voice, her voice is very soothing to me, but the story is horrendous. So that's what, anyway, but going back, so my parents, they met after the war. They married. My dad had escaped and actually was in the fort for the Czechs in the war and was a decorated soldier at the end of the war. So he actually was, you know, he had a lot of privileges there. He was actually given a home, a car, a business, and had some of the survivors from the family actually staying with my parents. So they had, life materially was actually very good for them, but my mother was from a very Zioni family, very strong cherut. My late grandfather had gone to listen and had really was like a groupie of Jabotinsky. The family got papers to come to Palestine pre the Shoah, but the Savta did not get, and they were not going to leave her behind. And unfortunately, that cost them their lives. My dad, interestingly enough, was a passionate Zioni, but his formative years were spent in the Pressburg Yeshiva, which was definitely not a Zioni place. But they were very determined with the founding of the state to move to Israel, and that meant actually giving up everything materially. They couldn't take anything with them. They were able to take a carpet and a piano. I have no idea why, a piano that came with them on the boat, and you must see what this boat looked like. I mean, the picture of the Exodus, that's my late father-in-law, my wife's father from Atlanta, gave us a Haggadah that he got. He was a coin collector, and he got this. It had some sort of Israeli coin kind of embossed into the cover. So he got it at there was that place actually in Talbia. There's like a coin, what are called, pneumatologists or whatever. So he gave me this Haggadah, and in the Haggadah, and the Haggadah is really it's a story of Shivat Zion that sort of goes parallel to the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And in the Haggadah there is a photo of a ship arriving in Haifa with survivors, and I look at this picture and I see my parents in this crowd. You can't believe how they couldn't. I mean, we're not even talking steerage. I mean, I don't know how people. Anyway, but they gave up everything. They came to Israel with the founding of the state, and in fact, they sold the piano on the docks in Haifa to get some money. And they were initially taken to these Ma'barot, and then Dafka Erev Pesach. And I tell this story every Pesach to my kids at the Seder. Erev Pesach, my dad found a little house that someone had just moved out of. I guess somebody got housing somewhere in the country, so they moved out. My dad and these other family friends of theirs quickly moved into this house out of the Ma'barah, and he describes this Leila Seder, talking about Me'avdut lechairut, and how they, just the absolute joy of this, their first Seder of freedom in Medinat Yisrael. He said they danced till the early hours of the morning, that it was so meaningful. So he ultimately actually got a job at Tel Shomer Hospital as he was like in HR kind of thing. He was a pakid in HR. I think he was in charge of salaries and this, that, and the other. Donors would come primarily from the United States. They'd be taken around the hospital and that. And certainly what my dad saw with the people from the US, and also from the majority of them were actually religious. And my dad went to Chaim Shiba and said to him, it's really not mat'im. This is the central hospital of the state of Israel. This is the biggest hospital in the state of Israel. Doesn't even have its own Beit Knesset. And Chaim Shiba said to him, Fogel, ata rotze Beit Knesset, az ata teyaseh et Beit Knesset. So my father said, fine. And he established a shul in the hospital, which is how we landed up in South Africa. Because a year or two later, there was a delegation from South Africa that was led by Rabbi Nachum's his son, by Rabbi Newman. I forget his first name. And so he met my dad as part of my, because of course he was a rabbi, it was a bunch of, and then it turns out he's from Pressburg, which is where my dad had studied in yeshiva from the age of 10. And in fact, I think my dad had even eaten, the way they didn't have like a hostel or whatever. They would go to different families every day, and I believe one day he was actually at the Newman family, one meal of the week. So, because Rabbi Newman he'd been sent out. I think he'd been sent to the United Kingdom from where he went to South Africa. So, he then contacted my dad and asked if my parents would come to South Africa for 3 years. My father would work with country communities, and it sounded all very nice. I mean, they landed in a loch. My father grew up in a very, very poor family, very poor. I mean, total penury. I saw where he grew up. I mean, mud floors. It was kind of like, they didn't know from week to week if there was going to be food on the table for Shabbos. My mom grew up in a very, sort of in an upper middle class, very cultured family. They went to the symphony and they went to the theater and they skied in the winter and they went mushroom picking in the summer, and, very, very different lives that they led. But I sort of say this because they agreed to go to South Africa, and then they got plonked down in Tabanchu in the middle of the Free State, in the middle of nowhere. And if I think about it now, my poor mother, I should mention, by the way, that in their time in Israel, they were actually involved in establishing a yeshuv that is there until today. It is called Ramat Pinkas. Pinkas was a Chaver Knesset from Mizrahi who passed away. And so when they established this place, they named it after him. I have pictures of my dad with Ben Gurion and Hachnasat Sefer Torah. And in fact, last year I was driving in Israel with my daughter. Ramat Pinkas is actually not that far from Tel HaShomer and from Ben Gurion. And we were driving, and suddenly I saw this big shellet. This other Ramat Pinkas, I sort of screeched to a halt, nearly had an accident, jumped out, we took photos, we kind of drove around a bit. My brother's gone back there. Obviously the house that they had, it's actually a very nice, looks a little bit like Tel Mond, it's really villot. There aren't any like apartment buildings there. But anyway, they built wonderful friendships and relationships that lasted through until they passed away. So, but even there they had such a different life. Then they land up in the middle of the Free State where there's like nothing. My mom got to go once a week to a woman in the community who had classical music records, and it was on one of those things you had to wind, and she got to listen to some classical music once a week at this woman's house. The other thing they told that was kind of interesting was that the community actually built them a brand new house, and my brother found photos of it just recently. The house, and it was a big house, and it was new. So they come into the house, and the kitchen's got these new appliances, and this and that, and it's huge. They'd lived in a very small place in Ramat Pinkas. It's wonderful. My mother's sort of going through the house one day, and she says, like, where's the bathroom? They said, oh, that's in at the back of the backyard. And like, in Israel, they had indoor plumbing. My mom said no way in hell, and they did not move into the house until they got indoor plumbing, and then everyone in the Jewish community also got indoor plumbing. But this is all before I'm born. Anyway, so to get back to the whole family history, as I said, so from when I was a little kid, I knew about this, and I always wanted to learn more. And so from the age of, I guess, 10 or 11, I started reading books on the Shoah.
Did you ever ask your parents?
So my whole thing, I told you from age 5, was never to cause them any pain or anguish. So I couldn't ask them. It was too painful. It was painful for me, and I knew it would be painful for them. I mean, I can see once in my life, my mother made mention of being on a train. I guess, you read, I'm sure you've heard from lots of fathers you've interviewed, sort of more toward the end, they would put them on these trains they didn't even have, they were camel cars, but without even the top, and it was snowing. So it was freezing, and these people were all together, and people were freezing to death every night and all this. And we were visiting this Webner's in what was then Rhodesia. And it was at the dining table. For one reason or another, she told me this little snippet, 3-minute snippet of story. That's it. That's as much as I heard. In her 70s, before she passed away, one day in Netanya, she said the one very strong effect that the Shoah did leave my mother with was that she had zero object continency. In other words, if you were 2 minutes late, you're supposed to be home at 3:30, it was 3:32, she was in a panic. She was pacing at the front of the house, looking out the window, going down the driveway. When we moved to Sea Point, then she was always on the balcony looking for my dad. When we lived in Netanya, she was always on the balcony for my dad. He was a minute late, 2 minutes late, my brother, any of us. Sheer panic. Age 70, she says to me one day, she says, this is basically the 2 times she spoke about the show. She says, I guess maybe because when we got to Auschwitz, 1 minute I had a family and the next minute I didn't. And there was and there was nothing left. I mean, there was nothing. I mean, there was ash. It was just. And she said, I guess that's why I always worry. And I think to myself, if we had from the day after the show, if there had been cell phones, and you could text and you could check in with people, her whole quality of life would have been completely different. The other thing where the Shoah, I guess, did come into the picture, I guess that's why age 10, 11 was, there was my dad established Yad Vashem in South Africa. And he did a lot of fundraising. He built this Yad Vashem memorial. So there was all this Yad Vashem stuff. And then he brought out the head of Yad Vashem, and he brought out Simon Wiesenthal as a fundraiser. I remember their first fundraiser was actually with Chris Barnard, who had just done the first heart transplant. They'd have these gala evenings that would raise funds. I mean, I was too young to, I was a little kid, but I do. But so from then I just there was this unquenchable thirst, I guess, to try and understand what happened at a personal level. So it has been one of my life's goals to read any and every biography already autobiography of Shoah survivors, whoever they are, wherever they are in the world. I will, if I'm even the only person, if they wrote it just for their and I've actually read a few of those. Some of them are hand typed just for the immediate family of the survivor, and I managed to get a hold of them. And as I mentioned, I probably read like at least over 2,500 volumes, I'd say. What I've been doing the last couple years is also watching oral testimonies that are all there, that have been uploaded to YouTube. I mean, there's endless ones, and I listen to them all, and and it's amazing. After hearing thousands of testimonies, I am still sometimes just blown away by first of all, by the level of cruelty. I mean, just when I thought I'd heard just the worst thing that could ever happen to any human being on the face of the earth, I hear something even worse than that. And what astounds me, and that's why I am in awe of these people, is how they picked up and built lives. When I lived in New York many years ago, I was friendly with a couple, and his mother was an Auschwitz survivor. And he said to me once, and it was at a Thanksgiving dinner we had at them. So we're going back to probably 1993. But I thought what he said was very profound, because he said to me, after the Shoah, what the Jewish people should have done was they should have burnt down the world. That's what they should have done. And what did they do instead? They built a new country. And I thought that was very profound. And that's sort of, I'm not getting into politics here and that, but just all the nonsense that goes on with the Palestinians and this whole victimhood thing, we've never played that role. All those thousands of years of pogroms and massacres and whatever, we didn't go and blow up churches, we didn't go and murder school children or whatever, we just tried our best to pick ourselves up and build ourselves up again.
Ilan, can I just ask you, in your listening to testimonials and reading all the literature and the books and people's life journeys and what they experienced, do you find, what I found amazing in the interviews is that many retained, in fact, their faith. And I found it is astonishing, and there's those who didn't, and they're definitely the minority. And I will tell you that, boy, no judgment from me. The fact that any of them could have any emunah at the end of all of this astounds me. But you make a very good point, because the vast majority did maintain their emunah. They believe in Hashem.
Which I really think is remarkable. And my own personal philosophy is that the establishment of Medinat Yisrael was key, because I think without that, I just don't see how the Jewish people could have sustained themselves after the Shoah. To still be at the mercy of the Goyim and the anti-Semites and not be, standing on our own 2 feet in that after the Shoah, I think we would have I think it was necessary to save the Jewish people. So that's my personal philosophy.
I just read in the last week, somebody said, they wrote that when they were in the DP camps, and they said, if you can't go to Palestine, where do you want to go? They said, we want to go back to the gas chambers.
Wow.
There's nowhere else for us to go. And many came to and it was dangerous coming here, and it was the War of Independence.
But even before, it astounds me. Well, it astounds me that right through, this is where you see the this is where Hitler had everything where he wanted. You know, when they had not the Wannsee conference was where they decided on the final solution. The Evian conference, where they went to brought all the nations of the world and asked them, well, because Hitler just wanted the Jews out. He didn't necessarily need to kill them. And all these countries all around the world came and they all said, us? No. We can't take Jews. I mean, it's an unfortunate situation, but not us. And Hitler saw that nobody wanted.
Jews too many.
Nobody wanted the Jews. So Hitler knew then he had it all put together.
I think the Dominican Republic was the only country that were prepared to take.
Look, with the St. Louis, the St. Louis was going to Cuba, and then Cuba backed out at the end. Yes, there were a few.
It went via Miami, and no one protested, and it was sent back.
Shum. But the British, not only the fact that everybody shut their doors, so that's why that was a one-way ticket to Auschwitz. But then even after the war, to think of the British not letting these straggled survivors come in here and then putting them in camps and sending them to Cyprus or sinking the boats sometimes. I mean, how cruel, but we digress. Anyway, so to tell you a little bit about my parents' families and their stories. So my mom grew up, she was one of 5 kids. As I said, grew up to a kind of upper middle class. It seemed to be just a very warm family. They had extended family in the area. It just sounds like her childhood and her early teen years were just idyllic. I mean, and they were sort of the core. So all the uncles and cousins, everybody always came to them. They did tons of things together.
And where did she?
This was in Czechoslovakia, in Solotvina. And what is also interesting is that many testimonies I've listened to or read from people from that area, it really does seem to have been just a wonderful Jewish community that was warm and welcoming and just very kind of upbeat. So much in Eastern Europe was not upbeat. Just really positive, warm, welcoming, nurturing community. And so things first turned when the Hungarians came in 1938. So that's when the anti-Semitism stuff sort of picked up. But all along, my mom said they never thought, and this is common when you hear survivor testimonies, that was thought, not us, we've been like, my grandfather was a decorated war hero. I mean, he fought for the Hungarians, because it was always Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. I mean, the borders kind of kept changing, Ukraine. But they said it's not going to be us. I mean, we've been here for like 9 generations. We've given and we've whatever, and we fought in the wars and this and the other. Then my mother was actually in Budapest March. I forget I think it might have been March 31st, it might have been March 28th when the Germans marched in. She actually got on the last train out, and in fact she had to literally run in. In fact, a guy pulled her by the hand and yanked her up into the thing, so she was able to get home. She had been there actually trying to get papers sort of proving their family's residency for many generations, because they were saying, if you could prove that, then you weren't going to get sent to the east to work, so-called. But in the end, nothing helped. She spoke about her so-called best friend from school, seeing her one day go out, or she didn't see the yellow star, and she said, I'm going to go to the authorities and report them. Then the neighbors turned on them. I mean, everybody turned on them, and I think they had first Seder night at home, and then in the morning the Germans came and said, out to the ghetto. They were in the ghetto till I guess the end of Iyar. And she also talks about her little brothers, which is, her one brother was 11, the other brother turned 13 in the ghetto. The bar mitzvah was a secret little, running out to just form a minyan so he could be called up. It was certainly no celebration or anything. And she said her brothers I'm just in awe of them, they would go out the ghetto, they would crawl under whatever to get, she said there wasn't food. They went and that was at risk of life and limb. And then right before Shavuot, they were, and I've read about all these transports and where they stopped and where they took and how big they were. But right before Shavuot, they were taken to Auschwitz. They got their Bet Sivan. And she said her father, who'd always been a big optimist and was very upbeat and all the rest, she said in the train, he was crying and her uncle was crying, and he said, it's over, we're done for. When they got to Auschwitz, her mother and her 2 younger brothers were gassed right away. She was sent with her sister to the Reich by Mengele, as was her father and her brother. Neither knew that the other was still alive. As you've heard, and I'm sure in many of the testimonies you heard, when the whole thing was just like, she said when they took them, they shaved them. She said they didn't know. She didn't recognize her own sister. She didn't, everyone was just totally shocked in the woman. They came to the barracks and they said, when we're going to see our parents, and the people, the Slovakian girls who'd been there for 3 years already, said, what parent? You see the smoke up there? Those are your families. And they couldn't believe how cruel they were. And I've heard this story literally thousands of times. Again, no judgment, because who knows what went on there. But she did manage to stay with my aunt. They were there for a few months. Then they were taken to Germany.
Did she get a tattoo?
No. So with the Hungarian transports, that was so massive. They killed 450,000 people in 10 weeks. So they weren't even tattooing them at that point, because also they did, those that they kept, they went to sea lager, the sea camp, and from there they were going to send them out to other places, which they did. So they sent my mom and my aunt to Frankfurt to actually help build the runway at Frankfurt Airport for the Messerschmitts, which got me. We started talking about this whole thing with when I landed in Germany, and then I actually did reach out to this Lufthansa guy to see if there was any way I could get any kind of access to records or whatever, but I'll finish that story afterwards. And from Frankfurt, they were taken to Ravensbrück. And Ravensbrück, I've read about Ravensbrück. My mom said that Ravensbrück made Auschwitz feel like a holiday camp. It was so cruel and so horrible, and there wasn't food. And she said people just died. She said every night, 200 friends would. She said it was just nightmarish. It was literally hell on earth. It was just. And then they were taken on a death march. And actually at Ravensbrück, she got typhus, and that's when she gave up. And my aunt just kept at her and would not let her die, and gave her from her food and this and the other. She made it through that. And then on the death march, my aunt's leg got septic, and was also my mom had to carry her on the death march, which I'm also just astounded by. And other things, working at Frankfurt Airport in the middle of winter, December in the winter, barefoot in the ice and snow. How did they do it? And they were starved. And why didn't they get frost? The whole thing makes no sense to me how these people survive. It makes absolutely no sense.
So this was in Frankfurt, where the airport is?
Yeah.
So what about the Germans living in Frankfurt?
Please. My mom said, especially even on death, the Germans would see them. She said they weren't human. They didn't see them as even human. Elie Wiesel said, I always say they treated the Jews worse than animals. He said that's not even true, because the Jews were not even considered worthy of. Animals are considered worthy of life or of existing. He said we weren't animals. Animals were in a way better position than we were. To get back to the story of Frankfurt Airport, it's going to be a little bit fragmented, because I had to go to Germany for the first time, and I tried this. But what I did do was I went to Google and I put in Hungarian women Auschwitz Frankfurt Airport, and I got hits right away. But to the point that there is a movie. So it turns out in about 1988 or 1990, some high school students in Frankfurt were on some sort of a hike, and they came on what was actually this camp that my mother was at. It was called Waldorf. And these students, they were like 11th or 12th graders, they actually did research on this camp. And in fact, it turns out, reached out. They found all the paperwork and all the rest, and they reached out to survivors around the world. They put a monument up there, and they have made a movie about it. It's called Rollbahn, which means runway in German. I've tried to get hold of this movie. I can find it. I mean, you go to look up Rollbahn, it'll actually come up as with an IMDb number, but I've not been able to get hold of the movie. I actually was in Berlin, and so I reached out to Porat Jacobson, who lives in Berlin, to ask him if he could try and find the movie for me somehow, in whether through stores or online or whatever in Germany. I don't know how hard he tried, but he said he wasn't able to get it. So I've not been able to access the movie. But there is a movie about it, interestingly enough. Now, I was in Frankfurt. I had a few hours, and so I thought I'd go. It's very near to Frankfurt Airport, this camp, or what's left of it, and the memorial. And I went out, and actually, the taxi drivers, they were all Muslim and Arab, and I couldn't start asking somebody to take me to. I couldn't. That wasn't how I wanted to get there. On that first time, the Lufthansa guy did give me the name of an Israeli tour guide who lives in Frankfurt. He said, reach out to him. He may be able to take you to the Waldorf camp. And I reached out to the guy, and he said, actually, I'd be happy to do it, but I am, booked up for the next 3 weeks, and you're coming on Tuesday. So I still have not been there. That's my uncle and my grandfather, and as I always say grandfather, my uncle was 15, my grandfather was 42 or 43. They actually made it till almost the very end. And they did get numbers, by the way, and literally 2 days before liberation, they were on one of these trains, and maybe, we sell rights about that. They were on this train for 12, 13 days, open, snow, no food, no nothing, people just dying every few minutes. And at one point they told them to get off the train. When they got off the train, they started shooting them, and my grandfather was actually shot, and I found this out 2 years ago. We never knew. We were always told that the train door had shot on his arm and he got tetanus and he died. My uncle finally told us at a memorial for their community. There is a memorial for the Slottville community at the cemetery in Netanya. And because a lot of survivors from Slottville landed up in Netanya. And my uncle said that actually his father was shot and died in his arms. And 2 days later they were liberated.
Wow.
Which also kind of just tortures me, because to
they
go
knew
through all that.
They knew they were using the war.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was the story. So what actually happened? So I told you my mom was carrying my aunt on the death march. One morning they woke up. They were put in a barn that had coal, and they were actually sleeping on the coal. And they were woken up in the morning by the Russian. They saw that the guards were gone. All the Germans were gone, and the Russians were there, and they were told they were liberated. My aunt was very sick, and she landed up being hospitalized for about 6 weeks, and my mom stayed with her. My uncle had gone back home in the meantime, and he was all of 15. He went back home, and no one was there, and he assumed everyone was killed. Very fair assumption. 95% of them were killed. So he didn't know that his sisters were alive. Now, they were stuck for 6 weeks in Germany while my aunt was recuperating. Then they went back home, and they heard that my uncle had been there looking for them. So they knew he was alive. He did not know. And it took a year till they saw each other. He went back to Germany. He was in a DP camp. He was sent to an art school. He was taught sort of motor mechanic stuff there. And then was sent to Israel to fight in the War of Liberation, where he lost many of his friends. Those who had survived the war, he then lost them in 48. The other strange thing is that, so my mom and my aunt went back home. The people in the house who my mom saw literally, these guys moving, I mean, they were being dragged out of the house. These guys were waiting at the gate just to move in. So they wanted to, my grandparents had hidden certain stuff, jewelry, and Neirot Shabbat. There was like a secret compartment somewhere in the wall. They would not let them have access to it. And then they went to their neighbor who their mom had left clothes with and her fur coat. And the neighbor said, and also they found out from the neighbor that their brother had been there looking for them. The neighbor said, "What fur coat?" There's a reason I'm telling the story. "I didn't get a fur coat from your mother. I didn't get any. All I got was whatever. There's 2 tablecloths." So they knew that wasn't the case, but that's what they got. And they were actually given their father's shas, which apparently was this beautiful green leather-bound shas. But they were these 2 girls with nowhere to go, whatever. The shas was very heavy. They ended up giving it to the butcher who had survived. I wish I could get this. I have no way of tracing it or finding it. The reason I tell you about the fur coats, and my mom told me this story was on the, this was one story she had said, and it's on the recording. Whatever, 40 years later, I go with my uncle and my cousin back to their house. So my uncle agreed to go back. I'd always wanted to go back and see their house. So we make our way to Solotvino, which is now in the Ukraine. So it was a whole thing. You had to get a visa, you had to agree to pay for a hotel room for 1 night in Uzhgorod, which we did, which was dumb. We flew to Budapest, we had a driver, took us to Uzhgorod, we stepped there. We drove to Solotvino. It's the craziest thing. So bear in mind, my uncle has not been there for 45 years. He was a teenager. He was 15 when he was last there. He finds the house. We get out the car, and as he steps out the car, this woman comes running towards us saying, "Zalmi, Zalmi, Zalmi." I'm thinking, who the hell is Zalmi? This is my Uncle Shlomo. So it turns out their family name is Zelmanovich, and his nickname as a kid was Zalmi. Now how this woman would know when she last saw him at 15 and he's now 75, so it's 60 years later, how would she know? But she recognized him, and it was all like this big, she was hugging him and this, that, and the other. We went to the house. I guess the son of the people who took the house when they were taken to the ghetto was there. He's a dentist, ironically. His teeth were all gold. He looked like something from a Bond movie. He was ugly as all hell. He was yucky. He wouldn't let us in the house. And my uncle was I didn't know, my uncle said off, because my uncle was sort of like pounding on some wall or whatever, and he said, "Yeah, we found the stuff, you're not getting it." So I don't know. I really want to go back, because I want to see if I can find the Shabbos candles, if they're still somewhere in the house. He wouldn't let us in. The neighbor takes us, she says, "You have to come see my mother." Her mother was 99 years old at the time. So so we go in, she's blind, she's lying in a bed. My uncle tells me this afterwards, but I didn't know till years later when I heard the story about my uncle says, she's saying, I think she's like senile, she's saying she's sorry about the fur coat, she should never have taken the fur coat, why did she take the fur coat? We didn't know what the hell she was talking about. Years later, I listened to my mom's testimony, and she says they asked for their mother's fur coat, and she said, "I don't have any fur coats." And now when she's 99, she has charata, that she took the fur coat. Anyway, and then they took us to one other woman. They said there was one other Jewish woman. This neighbor was not Jewish, but that there was a Jewish woman who lived in town, who'd been part of the community. And we went there, and it was completely bizarre. This woman, I found out her story afterwards, but this very sort of rough, gruff woman. She's living in like what was the maid's rooms in South Africa. So it's like the back of the house. It didn't even have a proper door. It had like a curtain. It's a little room. We go inside. I'm not understanding a word she's saying. She's talking to my uncle in Hungarian. But I look on the wall, and there's photos of Chayalei Tzahal. I mean, and she says it's her grandchildren. I think, what? So it turns out she was a capo, and she turned her own people in, and she beat people like my mother and all the rest, and she was this, And she didn't, so when people went to Palestine, when they went off, she didn't dare go because there was like a price on her head. So she lived her entire life married to some goy in this little churva in Solotvina in the Ukraine. But it turns out her children actually, or certainly her grandchildren, moved to Israel. The other fascinating thing about the Ukraine was that it was so, oh my God, it was like being in, it was, you know, they killed all their Jews and they lost all their development. It was like going back 100 years. The roads were horrible. They were potholed and pockmarked. People didn't have indoor, they'd lost their indoor plumbing. I mean, my mother grew up with indoor plumbing. In fact, the street my mother was on was this beautiful street that was cobbled, you know, and had these lanterns and all the rest. None of that's there. It's all mud. And what we'd see when we were driving on the roads, like every 2 or 3 kilometers, you would see a person sitting at the side of the road selling a cabbage. A cabbage. Wow. Selling a cabbage. And that's all that they sold. And I thought to myself, so like, what do you do? Then you come home one day and say, hi, honey, it was a great day today. I sold the cabbage. And they said, so what did you buy with it? I bought another cabbage. Wow. Totally primitive. They're using, you know, primer stoves and all the rest. I mean, it's a total loch. You know, they killed their Jews, they killed everybody, they got rid of them, and they lived like 100 years behind us. So that's my mother's family. My father's family, he was taken, which is what they did in Hungary, he was taken into forced labor camps around about 1942.
Can I just ask at this point, did your father speak to Yad Vashem, or did he give
He spoke much more. He spoke about, now he wasn't in concentration camps, he was in labor camps, but he...
Was he recorded? Did anybody do it?
Well, for one thing, he wrote his own autobiography. Actually, Harold Bloomberg was the editor. He used to be the editor of the Jewish Times, the Jewish Times in South Africa, and who also, I mean, it's very, very different, and who also wrote Ben Gurion's autobiography. He wrote Ben Gurion's autobiography, but he edited my dad's autobiography, very different. And my dad was in forced labor camps. You know, he spoke about when he was taken away first and his mother waiting at the station. And he said they put them on the train. It wasn't cattle cars.
And which town was your dad born in?
He was from Tornolia, also in Slovakia. So he was taken, and he said they put him on the train, and then the train sat at the station for 6 or 7 hours. And he said he watched his mom on the platform, and she did not budge until the train finally pulled out 6 or 7 hours later. She stood there for 6 or 7 hours. And he said she knew that she would never see him again. So she was killed in Auschwitz. His dad died before the Nazis came. He was the youngest of 9 siblings. His oldest brother was 18 years older than him. Oldest sister was, I guess, 17 years older than him. She went to the United States when he was 2. And in fact, he didn't see her for 40 years. And she came to South Africa, and there was all these things in the newspaper because it was siblings reuniting after 40 years. His oldest brother, another fascinating story, very tragic. His oldest brother was married and had 4 kids. I don't know how his family was murdered. I suspect they were murdered in front of him because he did not know the names of his own children. Never remembered them. So after the war, when my dad went for he weighed like about 62 pounds after the war. And this guy was like 6'2". My dad heard after the war where he was, that he was in some hospital. My dad went and got him and lifted him. He said he weighed nothing, brought him home, and they nursed him back to health. So he lost his wife and children. The woman he married lost her husband and children. They married but they did not ever have kids. So we never knew the names of his children. We just knew he had 4 children. So here's the story. After my aunt, his wife, passed away, they both passed away when my parents were still alive. They had bought plots on, the entrance to Yerushalayim. Not Har HaMenachot. So she was buried in Har HaMenachot, he was buried in Har HaMenachot. After my mom died, my dad got involved in all sorts of things. He ended up marrying my mom's best friend, Yocheved, had a wonderful, wonderful marriage together. But I guess that sense of being alone, the time that he was and whatever, he sort of got interested in doing shidduchim for like older people. He got involved with that. And he happened to talk to a woman who was a realtor in Har Nof. And he got friendly with her. And she, at one point, he was supposed to speak to her, and she gave a message, and unfortunately her mother had passed away, and she wouldn't be able to speak with him for a while. He couldn't go to the funeral, but he went to the Shloshim when they put up the matzeva. Where is this woman buried? She's buried in the grave next to my uncle. Okay? It turns out she is the sister of his wife who was killed. He never knew she was alive, and not only that, on her matzeva are the names of the kids that we never knew our entire lives.
The 4 children.
Of the 4 children.
Unbelievable.
You can't make that stuff up. So he ends up being buried next to his late wife's sister, who he never knew had survived, and on her matzeva is his wife's name and the 4 kids. So those names are now actually on my father's matzeva. So on my father's matzeva are the names of all the family who were killed, including his brother's wife and their children. My father's other sister and her kids and husband were all murdered on arrival. I'm named after his sister. Her name was Yolan. I'm Ilan. And then...
This was the arrival in Auschwitz.
Yeah. He had one brother who had actually gone to Palestine before the Nazis came. So one brother was in Israel. And then the other siblings actually survived. So bear in mind, there were 2 who were not in the Shoah. There were 2, and then his brother, okay, here's another sipur that you just, I'm telling you, it actually really is incredible. I mean, I should write a book about this. It's not in my dad's book. So listen to this. My father's brother, Moshe, who was like the closest to him in age, was in a forced labor camp, and a group of also Jewish prisoners coming the other way, amongst them was their rabbi's son. And he saw my uncle who was whatever, he was probably in his 20s already by then, my uncle, and he begged him, he said, they haven't given us any food for days, can you give me some food? So my uncle Moshe gave him his piece of bread. And the name is Reinitz. Their rabbi in Tomoya was Rabbi Reinitz, it's Rabbi Reinitz's son. Okay? My uncle gave him his bread. The guard saw this, started beating up my uncle. The other guard came and said, what are you wasting your time, like beating him up, using all your energy, just kill him. And he took his gun and he killed him on the spot.
For giving bread?
Yeah. I mean, Jewish lives were worth nothing. For giving bread to the rabbi's son. Listen to this story. So the one interesting thing was, they were in a town then that's called Shatu Rayu Uyel. It's a name for a town. It's where Leah Bronner comes from, by the way. They allowed the prisoners to bury him. So he actually had a kever, which nobody else had from the family. After the war, when my dad found this out, he went to the kever and he put up a matzeva. And we have a photo of the matzeva. And then in 1993 or something, my dad and my aunt, I went with them. We wanted to find the kever and bring the guf back to Israel. So we actually went to Shatra Yohel, we went to the graveyard, and it wasn't because of anti-Semitism, actually a ton of these slabs had actually fallen over, and I guess it was like marshland, so graves had sunk, tombstones had gone over, things had shifted, and we couldn't find it. We had a photo, but a lot of stones were like flat that way, and you couldn't, I mean, these things weighed like 300 pounds, we couldn't lift them, plus graves had moved, so even if you did, you wouldn't even know Because my dad was, his father died, I told you, before the Nazis came, and his father's body was brought to Israel, and he's buried in Netanya right next to my parents. But listen, so Brother Moshe gives his bread to Rabbi Reinitz's son. Brother Moshe is murdered for that, and that's as much as we know about the Reinitz family. Okay, so cut forward to, I don't know if it was in the late 90s or I think it might have been in the early 2000s or the late 90s. There was a pigua on a Motzei Shabbat, on a bus, on the number 1 bus that was coming from the Kotel.
I remember that.
And one of the people who was killed was a father of 12 kids from Kiryat Sanz in Netanya, right by Lanyado. My dad saw this in the paper, and he saw that the name. Now, I didn't know this. We found this out on the Saturday night of Shiva. So listen to this. On the Saturday night of Shiva, the phone rings. There was like about 200 people came to the apartment that night. The phone rings. I happened to pick it up, and this person with a sort of a Yiddish Hebrew accent is asking if there's separation of the sexes in the Shiva house, if men and women are separate, and I was very speculative. I said they're not, and he said, a good tavoch, thank you very much. So, about 50 minutes later, there's a knock on the door, and a Haredi woman and 2 Haredi men come in. And this is the story that they tell us. She's actually the widow of the man who was killed on the bus with their son. So she lost her husband and her son. They had been in Yerushalayim at a bar mitzvah, and they were coming on that bus from the Kotel when the bus was blown up. It turns out that my dad had actually been helping to support her since that time. My dad was an Orthodox rabbi, I didn't have any money, but both with whatever funds he had, but it also fundraised. My dad was in touch with tons of people all over the world, and had been actually helping to take care of them for the last 6-7 years. And what is their name? It's Reinitz.
Wow.
And I think her husband who was killed was, I believe, the grandson of the Reinitz, who was the rabbi's son, who my uncle had given the bread to.
Look at the connection.
Can you believe this? I mean, my father's autobiography is called Nothing Happens Haphazardly. I mean, my father had this strong belief that, and I mean, he has in the title, in the introduction to the book, he speaks about meeting with Rabbi Dushinsky the day before Rabbi Dushinsky died, and Rabbi Dushinsky gave him this Dvar Torah. And he said, when we say in Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvakot, Meloch Ha'aretz Kavodo, Melo is Rashi Tevot for Mazminam Lefundak Echad. That Hashem brings people together, and you don't know why and how and whatever, but it's not coincidence that nothing happens haphazardly. So we have these 2 crazy stories related, but one with my uncle, with the kids being then the names right next to his grave in Har HaMenuchot, and then this Reinitz family who happened to be in Netanya. My dad read in the paper, and it turned out there's the connection to his rabbi from when he was a kid. I can't get you bigger stories than that. My own obsession with the Shoah has just been throughout my life. My siblings are not like this, and I think that's good for them. The other thing I forgot to clarify right at the beginning of the story, when I said to you that I was this perfect child, I really was. I never stepped out of line. I can tell you, even though I don't practice as one, as a trained psychiatrist, I strongly do not recommend. It's just that's not healthy. You got to act out as a kid. You got to do your stuff. Don't straight. But I straitjacketed myself, and that's what I did. And you know what? In terms of what I did for my parents, I don't regret it. But it wasn't a healthy thing. And I still, every single day, and I can't help it. Every day, like when I take a shower, I don't think of the gas, but I do think, every time I get into the shower, I think, imagine not being able to wash for like 3 years. Being covered in lice and whatever. I relate things. Now, the other thing that I did do when I was younger, which was very bad, and I did stop that, it was always whatever. Let's say I was 7, 8 years old, and I had a fight with a friend at school, and I felt horrible about it. But then I'd say, wow, what's that? That's, compared to 6 million people, what's that? It's like all the tourists I had or whatever, I never acknowledged, and I always did it as a comparison in the extreme to what people went through in the Shoah, and then versus that, it was not shayach anything, but it is clearly part of why I read all these books and all the rest is like I literally want to understand. I want to know everything that they went through, and I now understand. You could put me in a debate with any Holocaust scholar, or a debate or a discussion or whatever, and I understand that whole process, from the Nuremberg laws to concentrating the Jews, to the ghetto, to the transports, to the whole thing. I know this stuff incredibly well. Unfortunately, it's not good stuff to know, but in terms of reading people's biographies and that, I feel it's the least bit of kavod that I can give them, because I am in awe of any and every survivor. I'm in awe of them. I'm in absolute awe of them. That they could do this and then come out of that and build lives and build families. And listen, unfortunately there were many who couldn't, and there's people, as you know, who've been in Ezrat Nashim and Talbiyah and wherever since the founding of the state, who just never. My father's one sister, she did marry, she had a son, they lived in the Krayot near Haifa, but she never came right after Auschwitz, and I don't know what happened to her, but she was never, the others were all
affected her.
Yeah. She never kind of came back from that. The others did, and I'm sure they had their suffering that they did quietly. But and then just to end off, really, the last thing I would say is that I'm in awe of my parents, which I did. As a kid, I didn't appreciate. As a kid, they had accents. They were older. They weren't cool. I find out so many things now about my friends' parents. A lot of my friends' parents were really not cool. And quite frankly, they weren't great parents either, which I didn't realize at the time, My parents were really wonderful. They were these positive role models. They were people with belief, and they were tzionii, and they taught us so much about, our home was so tolerant. We never judged if you were religious or not religious or whatever. It was, you were always welcome. And it's interesting because with both times after my parents died, we really got, honestly, certainly with my mom, we got thousands of letters, I'd say. With my dad, whether we hit over 1,000 or whatever, but the common theme always was how accepting they were, how nurturant they were, how warm they were, and how tolerant they were. That was kind of the message. Zil.
Ilan, can I ask you,
yes,
before you, have you ever been to Poland? And could
I
you ever
have.
go to, and have you been to
Okay, so I've got to tell you one now. We got to get one last story, which is Gabkon Mashu Lo Yuman. I went to Poland the first time. I went as a madrich on Mitzad HaChaim in around 1990 or 91. It was with kids from the United States. It was actually a horrible experience. These are very spoilt Jewish kids from parts of New York that are very, that are known to be very schwitzy and all that. It was just, there was no chinuch. I'll never forget, we left Treblinka and we left Majdanek, and the discussion in the bus was, were there going to be hair dryers at the hotel? There was no process. It was one day that I was there, I missed the bus. My bus is left, and I ended up getting on a bus with a group that was from Maryland. And their teacher on the bus, we just left, it was a mass grave. And I was with him on the bus on the ride all the way back to wherever we were going, if it was Lublin or wherever. It was a good hour, and the chinuch that went on that bus was unbelievable. Years later, I'm in Israel. I'm at the airport at Ben Gurion. There was Terminal 1, the old airport. There was this, I got to the airport, and there was this line all the way outside the airport. It turns out there'd been a shvita, and everything was backed up. Yeah, strike. And I'm on the line, and there's a man right behind me, and I'm looking. I say, I said, wait a second. I said, were you on March of the Living in 1992? He said, yes. I said, I got on your bus.
Wow.
I got on your bus and you were amazing. And we got into this whole long discussion because we were in line for a long time. And he said, I'm actually taking kids this next Mitzad HaChaim. Do you want to come with us? And I did. And it was a completely different experience. Completely different. It's like whatever, 4 or 5 years later. So I'd been twice to Poland. Freaked me out. I was terribly uncomfortable.
How was it when you went to Auschwitz?
It was very traumatic for me. Very, very traumatic. But we're not done with the story. For work, the last number of years I've been working in drug development and doing a lot of global travel, and I had a lot of trips to Poland. Whenever I go to Poland, I go to Birkenau. I go to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So, a little bit of a side story, and then we'll get back to the main. I had mentioned very early on in this interview that my mom passed away very tragically right before I got married, in very unfortunate and unnecessary circumstances. It was right before I got married. So when I walked down to the chuppah, first of all, I got my mom's wedding ring that then became my wedding ring, okay? And when I walked down to the chuppah, I chose the song from Shlomo Carlebach, B'Shem Hashem Elokei Yisrael. B'Shem Hashem Elokei Yisrael, Mimini Michael, Mismoli Gabriel. I really felt my mom was kind of there accompanying me down to the chuppah. Because this was weeks after. I don't know how I processed that or was able to do it, but that's what you do. So, why am I telling you this story? 3 years ago, and I've had my mother's ring on all the years. 3 years ago, I'm in Poland for work, and it's Yom HaShoah, actually. And I'm in a hotel, and a lot of the Mitzad HaChaim people, the big ones, there was Malcolm Honline, there was Malcolm Honline, there was Alan Dershowitz, there was Rav Lau, they were all in the hotel. And that night they had all sorts of different programming around Krakow.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, all related to Yom HaShoah. And so I had some work to do, and then I went for a walk, and I went past JCC, I went past some of the shores, and they were having different things. I'd sort of popped in all the rest. Come back to my room. It's just close to midnight. And so I actually open my computer, and I start, and it's certainly apropos for Yom HaShoah V'Gvura, I start watching a Shoah survivor testimony on my laptop. So I'm sitting right against the table, my hands like this, sitting at the table watching. Suddenly I get this terrible pain in my finger, like this burning. It felt like there was acid being poured on my finger. I don't understand. I mean, I sort of jumped and I did this, and I'm rubbing and I look, and my wedding ring is gone. Now, first of all, I'd worn it since I was married. Second of all, it was so tight that I tried with olive. My wife's going to have to go to a jeweler. They're going to have to cut it, which I didn't want to do. The ring was gone. The ring is missing from my finger. It's the night of Yom HaShoah. The ring is missing from my finger. I'm looking everywhere on the floor, and I'm thinking, I don't know. When I was walking back from being in Krakow, coming back to the hotel, I walked along it. I mean, it's not like somebody could have ripped it off. I would have known, not least of which I was in my room. By the way, I don't have an answer to what happened. I was in my room, I was totally comfortable. I'm in the middle of watching this testimony. It's past midnight, and I get this terrible burning on my finger that feels like acid, and the ring is gone. Look at that. Very upset. I was I had a hard time sleeping that night. The next day, we had a meeting in Katowice. Katowice is about a 40-minute drive from Krakow, and it's about a 35-minute drive from Auschwitz-Birkenau. So I said to the guy that I was with from work, I said, listen, when we're done, I'll meet you at the airport tonight. I am actually going to go to Auschwitz. He was Jewish, very unaffiliated Jew, and it turns out his grandmother was actually an Auschwitz survivor. So he said I said, tomorrow is March of the Living, Yom HaShoah. So I said, I'm going to go to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I want to be there for the march and ceremony, and I'll meet you at the airport. And he said, you know what, I'll come with you. She did. So we get to Birkenau. Have you been?
Yes, yeah. I was at the Revolution.
So we get to Birkenau, but the gates were shut. Why? Because the Mitzad was actually coming. It hadn't arrived yet. So they said, we have to wait for the march to go in, then you can go in. And so, okay, so you've been there, so you'll know. So you go through the gates, and then you get the long to where the railway line and where the thing was, where they sorted them.
Yeah.
There's a term they use, I'm blanking on the ramp, where the ramp is. And you look along the whole thing, and then at the far end is crematorium number 2 that was blown up, okay? And they had put speakers all the way down, so you can relate to this, you know. And the speakers were just calling out names of children. So it would be Yankele Rosen from Lublin, murdered age 3. You know, Hannele Huberfeld from Frankfurt, murdered age 2, whatever. And these speakers were sort of echoing down that whole railway line. Fine. I wanted to find where my mom's barracks was, and I knew she had been in C16. And I hadn't been there in 15 years or longer. I mean, if it hadn't been there in about 20 years. And it's so, and then Pitom we hear the noise, and I see Rav Lau and Malcolm Online and the Polish minister of whatever, and you know, Shevach Weiss, I think may have been there also. So they're coming, miyad, and I told the guy from work, I said, I'll meet you in 2 hours. I didn't want anybody with me. As soon as they went in, I literally slipped in right behind them. I wasn't waiting for the Homitzah to get in. I mean, it's thousands of people. And the names that are going, again, Rivkele so-and-so from here killed this. It's like I had an internal GPS, although I know the map. I know the map of Birkenau very well. So I wanted to find C16, where my mom was and my aunt was. And I cut through, actually, and I make my way through, and I get to C16. I'm standing there, I'm looking, you'll remember that all that's left, you know, they have the few near the beginning, but the Poles took all the wood and everything. That's left is just the brick things on the bottom and that thing in the center and the chimney. So I'm standing at the entrance of C16, and these names are going. I step over what's it called? The entrance to the thing. There's like a little slab there, like when you walk through a doorway. What do you call that? As you walk into a door, as you walk into the entrance of a house, you step over
It's like a threshold.
Threshold, right. So I step over the threshold into C16, and pitom, all those speakers along the entire camp that were just doing names, what comes through? B'Shem Hashem Elokei Israel. I mean, talk about Smamoret. I mean, I thought there's a connection to my email over here, because there's simply no way you can't make this stuff up. And the ring being gone, and so Debbie Sandler, to her credit, said to me, she said, your mother was telling you to let it go. To stop being so focused on the Shoah, and to stop being so focused on what she went through, and to stop coming back to Birkenau, and to let it go. And that's why the ring went, and that's why you had the ring which you've worn since your wedding, which was when you last had that song that you walked down to the chuppah to. Now you're here at Auschwitz, and your mother's giving you a message. I don't know the answer. I don't know whatever happened to the ring. I don't know how it got off. It was probably 9 months that I still had because the ring was the ring was too tight on my finger. So for 9 months, I still had the dent till that went away. But I'm not sure how we got to this, but it was something you asked me, and but it was sort of this like full circle.
And the ring
thing.
is a circle. The ring is a circle.
So that. Okay.
Wow. So Ilan, you really are, after what you've spoken and what you've related, the honor words. We go back many years from Yeshiva College. I remember them dearly. I actually remember your parents very well. I think the whole Jewish community remembers, especially the Joburg community. Your father was the rabbi in Eitz Chaim Shul in Berea. I remember the Yad Vashem there. I'd like to know what happened to that Yad Vashem, but I remember it very, very well, and it was very moving. And maybe my interest in the Shoah and the passion for interviewing survivors was that spark when I first went to Yad Vashem, because from our family we had no one who was, they were very Zionistic, but thank God in our family, on my side, no one was affected from the Shoah physically, although obviously we heard about it from our families. But going to Yad Vashem in Eitz Chaim, that was the only place really in Joburg that your father, he initiated it. And I remember very clearly, we used to go with our school, and I remember it like yesterday actually. And your parents were such a role model they were loved by everybody. And I cannot thank you enough. I really can't thank you enough. It's been one of the greatest honors to listen to you relate about your dear parents. And may their memory be for eternal blessing.
Amen.
And thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am so appreciative that you're here for such a short time, and that we've had this incredible opportunity to reunite and to hear. It's like blow your mind. And in your father's book, it's all min hashamayim. It was all meant to be, every single step of the way. The miracles you just see, it's not by chance. It's all min hashamayim. And that your father became a rabbi, and that he's Eitz Chaim. What does Eitz Chaim mean? And he was such an example for all of us to try and emulate, really. And your parents are extremely proud of you. We're all proud of you. And may you continue in your journey. And it's wonderful that you've picked up that mantle and you've continued. And I think it's very important what you're doing. And I really want to thank you so sincerely.
So that.